The silence in the grand hall of Salmir Palace was the kind that came right before a blade fell. 700 nobles stood frozen, jeweled fans halted midair, wine goblets forgotten in gloved hands, because Crown Prince Alaric Veyron had just done something no one in 300 years of imperial history had dared to do. He had torn the betrothal scroll in half, in front of the entire court, in front of her family, in front of the gods carved into the marble pillars, and let the pieces fall at Lady Seraphina Duvalle's feet like scraps of meat thrown to a dog. "I will not marry a thief," he announced, his voice carrying to the farthest balcony where the lesser nobles leaned forward hungry. "Lady Isolde Marchetti has shown me what true nobility looks like." This woman, he did not even look at Seraphina as he said it, embezzled from her own father's dowry chest to fund her family's failing trade routes. "I will not stain the imperial bloodline with a merchant's daughter who steals." The laughter started in the back rows first, then rippled forward like a disease. Fans opened to hide smirking mouths. Someone she never found out who threw a wilted flower at her feet. Seraphina Duvalle stood in the center of that laughter in a gown the color of drowned pearls, and she did not cry. She did not scream. She did not fall to her knees and beg, the way the prince and his mistress had clearly rehearsed for her to do. Instead, she bent down slowly and picked up both halves of the torn scroll. She looked at them for 3 long seconds. Then she looked up at Prince Alaric with an expression so calm, so terrifyingly composed, that the laughter in the hall began one by one to die. "Thank you, Your Highness," she said, loud enough for every balcony to hear. "You have just given me the only gift I ever truly wanted from you." No one understood what she meant that night. It would take the Empire 6 years to find out, and by then, it would be far, far too late. The carriage ride home was the longest hour of Seraphina's life, though no one watching her would have guessed it. She sat with her spine straight, her hands folded over the torn halves of the betrothal scroll in her lap, and she watched the palace lanterns shrink behind the carriage window until they were nothing but a smear of gold in the dark. Her maid Rilla wept quietly in the corner seat. Seraphina did not. "My lady," Rilla finally whispered, "how are you not crying?" Seraphina finished. Her voice was steady, almost gentle, "because crying is what he wants. Crying is what Isolde wants, so she can tell every noblewoman in the Empire how pitiful I looked. I will not hand her that satisfaction on top of everything else she has already taken." But when the carriage rolled through the gates of House Duvalle, and she saw her father standing on the front steps in his nightclothes, already informed by some faster rumor-carrying servant, something in her chest did crack. Lord Reynard Duvalle was 61 years old and had built his trading house from 3 ships into 30. That night he looked 80. He did not ask her what happened. He already knew every twisted version of it was spreading through the capital like fire through dry hay. "They will come for the warehouses next," he said quietly as she stepped down from the carriage. "A prince does not humiliate a merchant's daughter without also wanting the merchant's gold." He was right, of course. Within 2 days, 3 of House Duvalle's largest trade contracts were reconsidered by the Crown's Harbor Office. Within a week, 2 banking houses that had served the family for 18 years quietly declined to renew their lines of credit, citing reputational risk. No one said the words dowry theft out loud in polite company, but everyone repeated them in whispers, and whispers, Seraphina was learning, moved faster and did more damage than any army. The theft itself was a fiction from the very start. Seraphina had never touched a single coin of the dowry chest. She knew this the way she knew her own name. But she also knew with a cold clarity that surprised even her exactly who had access to that chest, who had the keys copied, and who benefited most from the Empire believing her a criminal. Lord Bertrand Marchetti, Isolde's father, had sat on the Dowry Oversight Council for the past 3 years. It was not a guess. It was the only door still standing after she'd walked through every other possibility in her mind, again and again, until dawn. Her mother, Lady Corinne, took to her bed the following week, her health already fragile, worsening under the strain of a scandal she could not fight, and a society that had abandoned her overnight. Seraphina sat by her mother's side each evening, holding her hand, listening to her whisper apologies for a crime her daughter had never committed, and it was in one of those long, silent nights that Seraphina made her decision. She would not beg the prince to reconsider. She would not write letters defending her honor to nobles who had already decided gleefully that she was guilty. Begging had never saved anyone in the history of the Salmir court. It only fed the appetite of people who enjoyed watching the powerful become powerless. There is a particular kind of hunger in cruel people, she realized. They do not want your apology. They want your collapse. And she refused, with every fiber of the composure she'd learned from a lifetime of being underestimated, to give it to them. Instead, 3 weeks after the humiliation in the Grand Hall, while sorting through her late grandmother's old study, a room the family rarely entered, kept locked more out of grief than secrecy, Seraphina found something that would change the entire shape of her life. Tucked behind a false panel in an oak writing desk that had belonged to Dame Lady Duvalle, her grandmother, was a letter. The wax seal on it was not the Duvalle crest. It was a symbol Seraphina had never seen before, a wren, wings spread, carrying a single coin in its beak. The letter was addressed simply to whichever of my blood is finally strong enough to open this. Seraphina's hands trembled, the first time they had trembled since the night of the ceremony, as she broke the seal. Inside was a short line of elegant, familiar handwriting. If you are reading this, child, then the world has finally shown you its true face the way it once showed me mine. Do not weep for what they took. Come and see what I built instead. A man will find you within the week. Trust the wren. Seraphina read it 4 times before she understood she was holding proof that everything the family had believed about her grandmother's quiet death 11 years ago might not be entirely true. She did not sleep that night. She sat by the cold hearth of the study with the letter in her lap, turning the strange wren seal over and over in her fingers. And for the first time since the Grand Hall, she felt something other than grief and fury settle into her chest. It felt terrifyingly like hope. 6 nights later, at the very edge of midnight, a soft, precise knock came at the servant's door at the back of House Duvalle. 3 taps, a pause, then 2 more. Rilla answered it, trembling, candle raised, and found an old man in a plain gray coat standing perfectly still in the rain, water dripping from the brim of his hat, his eyes fixed past her, directly on Seraphina, who had come down the stairs at the sound. "Lady Duvalle," the man said, removing his hat and bowing so low it seemed almost theatrical. "Your grandmother told me 11 years ago that you would come find this letter one day. She said I would know you by the way you refused to cry in front of people who wanted you to." Seraphina's breath caught. "Who are you?" The old man smiled, and there was something in it, grief and pride, and a terrible kind of relief that made the hair on her arms rise. "My name is Tobias Wren," he said. "I have been waiting 11 years to keep a promise. Will you let me in, my lady? What I have to tell you will take all night, and it will change everything you think you know about who your grandmother really was." Tobias Wren sat by the dying fire in the study for 6 hours that night, and by the time the first gray light touched the windows, Seraphina understood that everything she had believed about her family's past was, at best, half a story. Her grandmother, Dame Lady Duvalle, had not died quietly of a wasting fever 11 years ago, as the family had been told and had grieved for. She had been driven out not by illness, but by the same machinery of court cruelty that had just destroyed her granddaughter. Odalise had been a trade baroness of terrifying skill, a woman who had built House Duvalle's fortune from nothing, and the old imperial court of that era had hated her for it precisely because a woman with that much independent wealth could not be controlled. When a rival noble house maneuvered to seize her shipping routes through a fabricated smuggling charge, Odalise made a choice that history books never recorded. She let the empire believe she had died, faked her decline behind closed doors with Tobias's help, and quietly rebuilt an entirely separate trading empire under a different name hidden across 3 kingdoms answering to no crown at all. She called it the Wren Conquered, Tobias said, sliding a small iron key across the table, a key shaped like a wren in flight. 19 ships. 4 hidden ports. A banking arrangement with the Ashkeep trade guild that the Salmere court doesn't even know exists. All of it, my lady, sits waiting under seal, left in trust for the day one of her bloodline needed it more than they needed the Duvalle name. Seraphina stared at the key for a long moment. Why didn't she come back? Why didn't she save my father from all of this? Tobias's face softened with old sorrow. Because your grandmother learned the hard way that returning as herself would only hand the court a new target. She protected your family the only way she believed she still could, from a distance, in silence, and she was building toward a return she never lived to make. She left instructions, my lady. She always believed someone in this family would need the Wren Conquered one day. She simply never imagined it would be you, and never this soon. By dawn, Seraphina had made a decision that would have terrified the girl she'd been 1 month earlier. She would not stay and fight the rumors as Lady Duvalle, disgraced and cornered. She would disappear, publicly, completely, in a way that let the court believe she had fled the capital in shame, exactly as they expected a broken woman to do, while secretly stepping into the identity her grandmother had left waiting for her. She would become no one so that she could eventually become everything. Telling her father was the hardest conversation of her life. Lord Reynard, still reeling from the scandal, wanted to fight it the old way, petitions to the emperor, appeals to distant relatives with court influence. Even in his most desperate moment, suggesting Seraphina write a groveling letter to Prince Alaric begging for reconciliation to save the family name. It broke something in her to refuse him, to watch hope flicker and die in his tired eyes. "Father," she said gently, taking both his hands in hers, "if I beg him, I confirm to the entire empire that I am exactly what they already believe: small, guilty, powerless. I need you to trust me instead. Trust that I am not running away. I am going somewhere they cannot follow, and I am not coming back until they cannot touch us again." She did not tell him about the letter, the key, or Tobias. Not yet. It was safer, Tobias insisted, for her father's grief to be genuine when the court inevitably questioned him. A broken, humiliated man searching desperately for a runaway daughter was far more convincing, and far safer for everyone than a father hiding a conspiracy. 2 nights later. Seraphina vanished from House Duvalle exactly as the empire expected a disgraced woman to vanish. A hastily packed bag, discovered, missing from her room, a note in her own hand claiming she could not bear the shame, and intended to seek a quiet life in the eastern provinces. Her horse stolen from the stable under cover of night. The court devoured the story eagerly. Within a week, Lady Seraphina Duvalle was the empire's favorite cautionary tale, the thief who ran rather than face justice, exactly as Prince Alaric had painted her. What the court did not know was that Seraphina Duvalle had not fled east at all. She had traveled, hooded and silent beside Tobias Wren, 3 days south to a hidden cove where a single ship flying no flag waited at anchor, its figurehead carved unmistakably into the shape of a wren. There was one more piece of information Tobias gave her aboard that ship, in the last hour before they set sail, that she turned over in her mind for the entire voyage. He had spent years, quietly, watching the Marchetti family on Odalis's old instructions, because Odalis had never trusted Bertrand Marchetti even decades ago. What Tobias had learned recently, through contacts still loyal to the old Wren network, was this: the Marchetti fortune, the one funding Isolde's rise at court and her father's growing influence over the crown's treasury, was not nearly as solid as the empire believed. It was built on loans. Enormous, quietly accumulating loans, borrowed against a war chest the crown did not actually have. "They are not as rich as they appear, my lady," Tobias said, watching the coastline of Salmere disappear behind them into mist. "They are simply better at appearing rich than your family ever was at appearing modest. And appearances, in the world you're about to enter, can be bought, sold, and finally collected on, like any other debt." Seraphina looked back once at the vanishing shoreline of the only home she had ever known, and felt the last of the girl who cried into her pillow at night for a prince's approval quietly set sail with the tide. "Then teach me," she said, "how to collect." The hidden port city of Ashkeep Cove did not appear on any imperial map, and that, Seraphina quickly learned, was precisely the point. Built into a crescent bay behind 2 sheltering cliffs, it functioned as a free trade harbor answering to no single crown, a place where merchants from 6 kingdoms haggled, loaded, and sailed without a single tax collector from Salmere ever setting foot on its docks. Her grandmother had chosen it well. She took a new name the morning she arrived: Wren, no family name, no title, nothing that could be traced. Tobias insisted on it, and Seraphina, staring at her reflection in a cracked cabin mirror, found she did not mourn the loss of Lady Duvalle nearly as much as she expected to. Lady Duvalle had been humiliated in front of 700 people. Wren had not yet done anything at all, which meant Wren could become anything she chose. The early weeks were not glamorous. Tobias walked her through 19 years of her grandmother's carefully hidden ledgers, shipping manifests, silent partnerships, coded correspondence with guild masters across 3 kingdoms. And Seraphina discovered, with a mixture of pride and grief, that Odalis Duvalle had been quietly training a successor for over a decade without anyone in the family ever knowing. There were annotations in the margins of the oldest ledgers, small and private, that Seraphina suspected had been written with her in mind long before she was old enough to understand what they meant. "Watch the salt roots. Watch who controls hunger and you control kingdoms." Her first real test came within the month. A minor spice cartel operating out of Ashkeep had been quietly strangling smaller traders by underpricing cinnamon and pepper shipments until competitors went bankrupt, then buying their roots for pennies. It was crude, brutal, effective, and it reminded Seraphina uncomfortably of exactly the kind of cruelty that had been used against her own family. Rather than compete on price, which would have bled the still fragile Wren accounts dry, she did something Tobias had not expected. She quietly bought controlling interest in the warehouse the cartel depended on for storage, then simply raised the storage fees until the cartel's margins collapsed under their own greed. "You didn't fight them," Tobias observed, watching her calmly review the numbers afterward. "You made the ground they stood on more expensive than the war they wanted to fight. Titles taught me to fight with pride, Seraphina said quietly. Grandmother's ledgers are teaching me to fight with patience. I find I prefer her way. It was during this period that she met Lord Cashin Thorne, though she did not yet know he was a lord to her, and to everyone at Ashkeep he was simply Thorne. A sharp-eyed trader in his late 20s, who ran a modest fleet of merchant vessels, and had, according to dock gossip, once been someone of consequence in a kingdom he refused to name. He was the first person at Ashkeep to challenge her instead of simply doing business with her, questioning her pricing, testing her knowledge of maritime law. Watching her with the particular suspicion of a man who had been burned badly enough by someone once that he now trusted no one on principle. You negotiate like someone who has something to prove, he told her bluntly, over a dispute about birth fees in her second month. Or something to hide, possibly both. Everyone at this harbor has something to hide, Thorne, she replied evenly. You included. I simply choose not to pretend otherwise. He laughed, a short, surprised sound, as though it had escaped before he could stop it, and something in his guarded expression shifted slightly, though neither of them acknowledged it. It was not friendship yet. It was the first thin thread of respect between two people who had both learned, painfully, that trust was the most expensive currency in the world. For nearly a year, Wren built quietly. Small trade wins became larger ones. She expanded her grandmother's old silk contracts, secured a favorable arrangement with the Ashkeep Trade Guild that Tobias had been cultivating for years, and slowly, methodically, began doing the one thing her grandmother's ledgers had always emphasized above all else: buying debt. Small merchant debts, minor noble debts from kingdoms bordering Salmir, quiet purchases of struggling trade contracts that others considered worthless. Tobias questioned the strategy more than once. It seemed slow, unglamorous, unlikely to build the kind of fortune needed to challenge an empire. Coin is loud, Seraphina told him one evening, reviewing a stack of purchase debt agreements by lamplight. Everyone watches coin, debt is quiet. No one watches who owns their debt until the day someone calls it in, and by then it is far too late to stop them. It was a philosophy she would not fully explain, even to Tobias, for many months. But she was no longer building a fortune simply to feel safe, or simply to prove her innocence. Somewhere in the long disciplined months of ledgers and negotiations and small patient victories, the shape of something larger had begun forming in her mind. A plan that would take years, that required a stillness and a coldness she had not known she possessed, and that would end if she was patient enough and precise enough. With an empire's crown prince discovering exactly whose gold his entire future depended on. She was still turning that plan over in the quiet hours before sleep, refusing to let herself hope for it too soon, when a rider arrived at Ashkeep Cove 11 months after her disappearance. Breathless from a hard ride down the coast road, carrying a letter sealed with the Duvalle crest that made Tobias's face go pale the moment he read the first line. "My lady," he said, and his voice shook in a way she had never heard from him before. "Your father has been arrested." The letter, written in a clerk's careful hand and smuggled out by a sympathetic servant still loyal to House Duvalle, explained everything in cold, bureaucratic language that made Seraphina's hands shake with a fury she hadn't allowed herself to feel in almost a year. Her father had been arrested for unpaid crown levies, a debt that did not exist a month earlier, conjured into being through a sudden reassessment of House Duvalle's trade taxes, backdated 3 years, with interest calculated at a rate no honest court would ever approve. It was not subtle. It was not meant to be. It was a message, and Seraphina understood immediately who had sent it. Marchetti, she said, and the name tasted like iron in her mouth. Tobias confirmed it within days, using contacts still embedded in the capital. Lord Bertrand Marchetti. Having failed to fully seize House Duvalle's remaining trade routes through reputation alone, had grown impatient waiting for the family to collapse on its own, and had used his growing influence over the Crown's tax council to manufacture a debt large enough to force the seizure of the entire Duvalle estate, land, warehouses, remaining ships, everything. For the first time since she had left Salmir, Seraphina felt the old fear return, the cold, drowning panic of watching everything she loved be taken from her while she stood helpless to stop it. But she was not the girl standing in the grand hall anymore, and she forced herself, breathing hard, to think like her grandmother instead of like a frightened daughter. "How much is the debt?" she asked Tobias. 40,000 crowns, my lady. An impossible sum for your father to raise in the 30 days the council has given him. Seraphina walked to the strongbox where the Wren Concord's accumulated year of profits sat, opened it, and did the arithmetic in her head before Tobias could even finish protesting that it would drain nearly everything they had built. "Then we will pay it," she said, "not as Duvalle. As an anonymous benefactor, a moneylender's consortium settling a debt on the family's behalf in exchange for a modest stake in future Duvalle trade revenue. It will look like ordinary business. No one will suspect a runaway daughter is behind it, because a runaway daughter would have no such fortune to spend. It worked exactly as she predicted. The debt was paid through 3 layers of shell arrangements Tobias structured with the same precision he'd once used for her grandmother, and Lord Reynard Duvalle was released from custody within the week. Bewildered and profoundly grateful to an anonymous consortium he could not begin to identify. But the victory was smaller and more bitter than Seraphina had hoped. 4 nights after her father's release, a Duvalle warehouse on the eastern docks, one of the family's last remaining assets, burned to the ground in the middle of the night. The investigating watchman ruled it an accident. Seraphina, reading the report Tobias smuggled to her, knew better within the first sentence. "This isn't only about me anymore," she said quietly, staring at the report long after Tobias had gone to bed. "This was never only about me." It was in the weeks following the fire, digging deeper into Salmir's finances than she had ever intended to, that Seraphina began to understand the true shape of the empire she had once believed herself powerless against. The crown's treasury, drained by 2 costly border conflicts in the past decade, was far weaker than any noble at court dared whisper aloud. To fund the ongoing war in the northern territories, the Emperor's Council had begun quietly issuing war bonds, loans against the crown's future tax revenue, sold discreetly to noble houses wealthy enough to absorb the risk. Lord Marchetti had positioned his family at the center of this arrangement, using his growing influence to steer enormous portions of the crown's borrowing through Marchetti-controlled banking contacts, skimming commissions at every step, using the appearance of loyal service to the emperor to disguise what was in truth systematic theft dressed in patriotic language. The realization struck Seraphina with the force of a physical blow. The same corruption that had destroyed her family's reputation over a fabricated dowry theft was at its root. The very same machine slowly bleeding the entire empire dry. A court where desperation for gold had made cruelty and theft not just possible but profitable so long as you wore the right title while committing it. "They didn't destroy me because I stole anything," she said slowly, the pieces finally arranging themselves in her mind with terrible clarity. "They destroyed me because House Duvalle's trade routes were worth more to them broken and seized than they were worth to them intact and loyal." It was never about honor, Tobias. It was never about the prince's feelings for Isolde. It was arithmetic. From that night forward, the Wren-Concord's strategy changed. Seraphina instructed Tobias to begin quietly purchasing the crown's war bonds, not directly, which would draw dangerous attention, but through the Ashkeep Trade Guild and a careful network of foreign intermediaries who had no love for Salmir's court and no reason to refuse a generous commission. It was slow, expensive, unglamorous work, buying paper debt that most nobles considered beneath their notice, a fraction of a percent at a time. But Seraphina had learned in her grandmother's ledgers exactly what that paper debt would one day be worth. 4 months into this quiet campaign, a piece of news reached Ashkeep Cove that made Seraphina go very still over her morning correspondence. Prince Alaric's wedding to Lady Isolde Marchetti, long rumored, long delayed by court formalities, had finally been announced for the following spring. Funded, the announcement proudly declared by the generous wealth of House Marchetti, a demonstration of the empire's enduring prosperity. Seraphina read the line 3 times, and for the first time in nearly a year and a half, she smiled, a small, cold, entirely satisfied smile that made even Tobias, standing beside her, take an involuntary step back. "There is no Marchetti wealth left to fund a wedding," she said softly. "Not real wealth, only borrowed gold dressed up in silk and called prosperity, and I intend, Tobias, to discover exactly whose signature is on the loan that pays for it." The next 18 months were, by Seraphina's own private accounting, the hardest and most transformative of her life. A slow, disciplined siege fought not with soldiers, but with contracts shipping manifests, and an almost inhuman patience she had not known she possessed until grief and fury had forged it into her. She expanded the Wren-Concord's reach methodically, working through Tobias and a small, fiercely loyal circle of agents recruited from Ashkeep's most capable traders. She secured a controlling interest in the salt routes running between Salmir's southern coast and the neighboring kingdom of Vesine, a resource so unglamorous that no noble house had bothered to properly monopolize it, and so essential that within a year, nearly a third of Salmir's preserved food supply quietly depended on prices Seraphina alone controlled. She struck a formal alliance with the Vesine Trade Guild, a body the Salmir court had always dismissed as beneath serious diplomatic attention, offering them favorable terms no Salmere noble would have condescended to negotiate. In return, the guild extended her access to banking arrangements and shipping lanes that made the Marchetti family's supposedly formidable trade network look, by comparison, provincial and overextended. She learned, too, the particular loneliness of extraordinary success. Wren became a name whispered with respect and wariness across 3 kingdoms worth of merchants, a trader no one could out-negotiate, whose ships always arrived first, whose instincts for a failing market seemed almost supernatural. But no one at any of those tables knew her real name. Her real face beneath the traveling hood she wore in public dealings, or the real reason a woman who could have retired into quiet luxury after her first great successes instead kept building relentlessly toward, something she refused to explain even to Tobias. The reason arrived cruelly in the form of another letter. Her mother, Lady Seraphina Duvalle, had died in the early spring, quietly, in her sleep, of the same fragile heart that had never recovered from the scandal at the Grand Hall almost 2 years earlier. The letter, delayed nearly 3 weeks in reaching Ashkeep Cove, informed Seraphina that her mother had spent her final months believing her only daughter had abandoned the family in disgrace and never once written home. She had died, the letter said, still whispering apologies into empty rooms for a crime her daughter never committed, still hoping, until her very last breath, according to the housekeeper who wrote the letter, that Seraphina would someday come home. Seraphina did not leave her cabin for 3 days. Tobias, who had buried his own losses long ago in service to her grandmother, did not try to rush her grief or offer hollow comfort. He simply left food outside her door each evening and waited. On the 4th day she emerged, pale and hollow-eyed, and asked him a question that had clearly been circling in her mind through every hour of that silence. What was the point, Tobias? I built an empire hiding in the shadows to protect my family, and I let my mother die believing I had abandoned her. What good is any of this gold if it cost me the one thing it was supposed to save? It was the closest she had ever come in nearly 2 years to abandoning the entire plan, to simply riding home, revealing herself, accepting whatever consequences came, if only to hold her father one more time without a lie standing between them. Tobias let her sit with that grief for a long moment before he answered, and when he did, his voice carried the weight of his own old sorrow. Your grandmother asked me the very same question, my lady, the year after she vanished, the year her own husband died, still believing she was dead. I told her then what I will tell you now. Revenge and love are not always compatible on the same timeline. Sometimes protecting the people you love means becoming someone they cannot recognize for a little while longer. Your mother's death is not proof that this path was wrong. It is proof of exactly how much this path has already cost you. And I believe, knowing you as I do, that you are not the kind of woman who lets a cost like that be paid for nothing. Seraphina sat with his words for a long time, watching the candle burn low, and when she finally spoke again, her voice had changed, quieter but harder, like iron cooling into its final shape. Then it will not be for nothing, she said. I am done building this only to protect what remains of my family from a distance. I want my father to know the truth before he, too, dies believing I abandoned him. And I want everyone who laughed in that hall to understand before the end exactly whose gold their entire world was standing on. From that day forward, the pace of her campaign accelerated, within 6 months. The Wren conquered, through its network of guild partnerships and quiet foreign intermediaries, had come to hold nearly a fifth of Salmere's outstanding war bonds, along with controlling stakes in Salt Southern Silk, and 2 of the capital's largest independent banking houses. All without a single noble at the Salmere court suspecting the true identity or even the true existence of the woman behind it. It was ironically an ordinary trip to a public grain market in the border town of Calomere, a rare outing she allowed herself still hooded. To inspect a shipment personally rather than trust the report of an agent, that nearly unraveled 2 years of careful anonymity in a single terrifying moment. As she leaned over a crate of grain samples, her sleeve slipped back just far enough to reveal, for less than 3 seconds, the small wren-shaped signet ring she always wore on a chain beneath her glove, now exposed against her bare wrist. A voice behind her, low and startled, spoke the name she had not heard from anyone but Tobias in almost 2 years. Seraphina. She turned, heart hammering, to find Lord Cashin Thorne standing 3 feet away, staring at her wrist with an expression that told her, with sickening certainty, that he had recognized far more than just her name. For a long, dangerous moment, neither of them spoke. The market noise seemed to fade around them, the calling vendors, the clatter of grain carts, the ordinary chaos of Calomere's morning trade, until it was just the 2 of them standing in a narrow aisle between grain stalls. and the small Ren ring exposed on her wrist between them like a confession neither of them could take back. "You're not Ren," Cashin said quietly, and it was not a question. "You never were, not really, you're Seraphina Duvalle, the woman the crown prince accused of theft at her own betrothal." Seraphina's mind raced through a dozen possible lies in the space of a heartbeat: a stolen ring, a coincidence of appearance, a stranger who simply resembled a disgraced noblewoman from a court 2 years and 300 miles away. But something in Cashin's expression stopped her. He was not looking at her with the triumphant satisfaction of a man who had just uncovered a valuable secret to sell. He was looking at her the way one wounded person recognizes another. "If you meant to expose me," she said carefully, "you would have already shouted it across this market instead of speaking quietly." "I have no interest in handing anything to the Salmir court," Cashin said, and something bitter passed across his face. "I told you once I had something to hide too. What I didn't tell you was why." He glanced around the crowded market, then nodded toward a quieter side street. "Walk with me. I think, Lady Ren, or whoever you truly are, it's time we stopped pretending with each other." What he told her, over the following hour in a nearly empty dockside tavern, reshaped everything Seraphina thought she understood about the man she had spent 2 years cautiously trusting with business, but nothing more. Cashin Thorne was not, as the Ashkeep docks assumed, a minor trader with a mysterious past. He was the disinherited second son of a Salmir border lord. His family's estate seized 6 years earlier under a tax dispute manufactured, he now strongly suspected, by the very same crown financial machinery Seraphina had spent 2 years quietly dismantling from the shadows. His father had died in debtor's confinement. His older brother, broken by the family's fall, had vanished into drink and disappeared entirely. Cashin had rebuilt himself from nothing at Ashkeep, the same way she had, driven by the same cold, patient fury. "I recognized the ring the moment I saw it," he admitted, turning his untouched cup of wine slowly between his fingers. "Your grandmother's ring. My father spoke of Dame Odalise Duvalle once, years ago, with something close to reverence, one of the only nobles who ever treated small trade houses like ours with respect instead of contempt. I didn't understand then what he meant. I understand it a great deal better now, watching what you've built these past 2 years." Seraphina studied him for a long moment, weighing 2 years of hard-won caution against the rare, precious relief of finally being known by someone outside Tobias's small circle. "If I tell you the rest," she said slowly, "there is no undoing it. You would be tying your fortune and possibly your life to a plan that will eventually put me directly against the crown itself." Cashin met her eyes without hesitation. "Lady Duvalle, my fortune has been tied to a grudge against that crown since the day they dragged my father out of our home in chains. I would consider it an honor to finally point that grudge somewhere useful." It was, Seraphina would later reflect, the true beginning of the second half of her plan. The moment the Wren conquered stopped being one grieving woman's quiet campaign and became something far more formidable. Cashin's fleet, combined with his own network of disaffected border nobility eager for a chance at justice, gave her reach into corners of Salmir's economy the Wren conquered alone could never have touched. Together, over the following 4 months, they orchestrated their most ambitious move yet: a quiet, coordinated purchase, through no fewer than 7 separate intermediaries across 3 kingdoms, of a controlling charter interest in the Salmir Imperial Bank itself, the very institution responsible for underwriting the crown's war bonds, and as it happened, the enormous loan quietly funding Prince Alaric's upcoming wedding. The scale of what they uncovered, once Cashin's contacts inside the bank's junior clerical staff began quietly passing along records, exceeded even Seraphina's darkest suspicions. House Marchetti's fortune, so celebrated at court as proof of the empire's enduring prosperity, was almost entirely fictional, a tower of loans borrowed against loans, propped up for years by favorable treatment from bank officials who owed their positions to Lord Bertrand Marchetti's influence. The wedding itself, due to take place in a matter of weeks, was being funded by yet another emergency loan disguised in the official announcement as House Marchetti's generous wealth, but in truth drawn directly against the crown's own strained treasury, a loan that the Wren conquered. Through its careful acquisition of Imperial Bank charter shares now had quiet but very real influence over. "We could call it in," Cashin said one evening, staring at the final ledger that confirmed everything, his voice low with something between disbelief and grim satisfaction. "Right now, before the wedding. Collapse the whole arrangement overnight." Seraphina shook her head slowly, though every instinct screamed to end it immediately. "Not yet," she said. "If we collapse it quietly now, they simply borrow again from somewhere else, blame a clerical error, and marry within the month regardless. I did not spend 2 years building this to win a small, private victory that no one at that court will ever understand or remember. Her eyes hardened, fixed on some point far beyond the tavern's dim lantern light, already 3 moves ahead. When I finally call this debt cash-in, I want every noble in that grand hall watching. I want it to happen in front of the same people who laughed at me. And I want Prince Alaric to understand, in front of all of them, exactly whose gold his entire kingdom has been standing on. With the wedding now set for a single month away, Seraphina made a decision she had delayed for nearly 2 years. One that frightened her more than any financial maneuver she had orchestrated against the crown. She would go home quietly and tell her father the truth before anyone else did. She traveled to Salmir in disguise, hooded and unremarkable among a merchant caravan, and arrived at the modest townhouse, far smaller than the grand Duvalle estate she remembered, where her father now lived a quiet, diminished life on the edges of a society that had never fully forgiven the family's fall from grace. When Rilla, older now and gray at the temples, opened the door and saw who stood beneath the hood, she nearly dropped the candle she was holding. Lord Reynard Duvalle's reaction, when Seraphina finally stepped into the small parlor where he sat by a modest fire, was something she would remember for the rest of her life. He rose so quickly his chair clattered backward, his weathered face moving through disbelief, then joy. Then a grief so raw it bent him nearly in half as he crossed the room and pulled his daughter into his arms as though he still could not quite believe she was solid enough to hold. "Your mother," he whispered into her hair, his voice breaking, "she never stopped believing you would come home, not once in 2 years." "I know, father," Seraphina said, and for the first time in longer than she could remember, she allowed herself to cry, not from grief alone, but from the almost unbearable relief of finally setting down a lie she had carried for 2 years. "I know, and I am so sorry I could not tell her the truth in time." She told him everything that night, her grandmother's hidden legacy, the Wren-conquered Tobias Cashin, the war bonds, the bank charter. The truth about the Marchetti family's borrowed fortune, and watched her proud, humbled father's expression shift slowly from shock to something that looked by the end remarkably like his old fire returning. He wanted immediately to march to the Emperor's council himself and expose the entire conspiracy the following morning. "Father," Seraphina said gently, taking his hands the way she had 2 years earlier on the night she left, "I need you to trust me one more time. If we move too soon, they will simply delay the wedding, quietly repay a fraction of the debt from elsewhere, and disappear the evidence before anyone with real power ever sees it. I need 1 more month. I need the wedding to happen, or nearly happen, with every noble in that hall watching, before I call in what we're owed." It was, she understood, asking him to endure 1 more month of silence after already enduring 2 years of it. But her father, weeping and laughing in equal measure at the daughter standing transformed before him, simply nodded. "You are your grandmother's blood," he said quietly. "I should have known you would come back not as a victim begging for mercy, but as someone the whole empire would have to reckon with." The final weeks proved far more dangerous than either of them anticipated. Word reached Seraphina, through one of Cashin's contacts inside the Marchetti household staff, that Lord Bertrand had grown increasingly suspicious of the mysterious Wren-conquered, whose quiet acquisitions had begun appearing, again and again, in places uncomfortably close to his own family's finances. He did not yet know Wren's true identity, but he knew enough to be afraid of it, and afraid men, Seraphina had learned 2 years earlier in the ashes of a burned Duval warehouse, tended toward violence when cornered. The attempt came 11 days before the wedding, on a quiet coastal road outside Ashkeep Cove, as Seraphina traveled back from a routine meeting with the Vessing Guild masters. A single rider, cloaked and moving with the deliberate patience of a man who had done this before, tracked her carriage for nearly 2 miles before making his move, a crossbow bolt that shattered the carriage window inches from where she had been sitting only moments earlier before Seraphina's own guards trained, and paid handsomely for exactly this possibility, dragged the assassin from his horse. He was young, terrified, and once Tobias's methods of persuasion had been quietly employed in a locked cellar beneath the Ashkeep warehouse, remarkably willing to talk. He had been hired 3 weeks earlier, paid in advance, given only a description and a location to watch. He did not know the name Wren, but he knew, without question, the name of the man who had hired him and paid him half his fee up front in coin bearing the unmistakable Marchetti family crest. Seraphina stood over the trembling young man in that cellar, the confession finally recorded and sealed by Tobias's careful hand, and felt something settle into place inside her, cold, clear, and absolutely certain. "Lord Bertrand Marchetti has just handed me," she said quietly, "the final piece I needed. Not just his family's debt, his family's crime." The Salmir Grand Trade Summit, held annually in the week before any major royal event to allow the empire's most prominent merchants and financiers to present themselves to the court, had never once in its history featured a woman presiding at its head table. That changed on a cold spring morning 11 days before Prince Alaric's wedding, when the assembled nobility and guild masters of Salmir watched a formal procession enter the summit hall bearing a banner none of them recognized, a wren in flight, carrying a single coin in its beak, followed by a veiled woman whose escort included, to the visible shock of several, attending Lord Cashin Thorne, the disinherited border noble many had assumed lost to obscurity years ago. Presenting, the herald announced, his voice carrying through the stunned hall, the head of the Duvalle Trading Concord, controlling interest holder in the Salmir Imperial Bank Charter, principal creditor of the Crown's Northern War Bonds, and majority stakeholder in the Empire's Southern Salt and Silk trade, Lady Wren. The whispers that swept the hall were, Seraphina noted with quiet satisfaction from behind her veil, remarkably similar in tone to the ones that had once destroyed her, except this time they carried something the old whispers never had: fear. She did not reveal her true identity that day. That reveal, she had decided long ago, deserved a more precise stage. Instead, she spent the summit doing something far more devastating to House Marchetti than any public accusation could have achieved. She quietly, formally, and with impeccable legal documentation, informed the assembled council of guild masters and crown financial officers that the Duvalle Concord intended to exercise its rights as majority holder of the Imperial Bank Charter to review all outstanding loans currently financed through Crown-adjacent institutions, including, though she did not name it directly yet, a certain generous wedding fund recently celebrated at court. Lord Bertrand Marchetti, seated at the summit's high table in his ceremonial finery, went the color of old parchment. Within 3 days, the effect rippled through Salmir's financial circles exactly as Seraphina and Cashin had calculated. Nervous banking officials, terrified of being found complicit in loans that a majority charter holder was now formally scrutinizing, began quietly demanding early clarification on the wedding fund's true source. Crown Treasury officers, unable to produce clean records proving the fund came from genuine Marchetti wealth rather than borrowed Treasury gold, found themselves fielding uncomfortable questions they had no honest answers for. And Prince Alaric, increasingly desperate as his wedding, now just over a week away, threatened to collapse under sudden financial scrutiny he did not remotely understand, did the one thing Seraphina had been patiently waiting 2 years for him to do. He requested, through a formal and rather humiliating letter delivered to the Duvalle Concord's temporary summit residence, a private audience with the mysterious Lady Wren, whose cooperation his letter admitted with visible desperation between the careful court phrasing, had become essential to the continued success and dignity of the imperial wedding. Seraphina read the letter twice, standing in the modest rented parlor with Tobias and Cashin on either side of her, and felt something inside her chest, something that had been clenched tight for 2 years, finally, quietly begin to loosen. He is asking the woman he destroyed, she said softly, to save the wedding he destroyed her for. The audience was arranged for the following evening in a private chamber adjoining the summit hall, deliberately timed to fall during the wedding's official rehearsal, a detail Seraphina had specifically requested, and one that Prince Alaric's harried advisors, desperate to secure her cooperation by any means necessary, had not thought to question. She dressed carefully that evening, not in the traveling clothes of Lady Wren, nor the drowned pearl gown of the humiliated bride she had once been, but in a new gown entirely deep imperial blue edged in silver thread, chosen deliberately to evoke, for anyone who remembered, the exact shade of the Duvalle family crest. Prince Alaric entered the private chamber flanked by 2 advisors, visibly startled to find not only the veiled Lady Wren waiting for him, but Lord Cashin Thorne standing at her side, and an elderly steward he did not recognize standing quietly by the door with a heavy leather ledger tucked beneath his arm. Isolde Marchetti, uninvited but unable to resist her curiosity about the mysterious financier holding her wedding hostage, arrived moments later in a swirl of silk and barely concealed irritation. Lady Wren, Prince Alaric began, his court composure fraying visibly at the edges, I understand there has been some misunderstanding regarding the financing of certain wedding arrangements. I am prepared to discuss favorable terms for the Concord's continued discretion in this matter. Seraphina let the silence stretch for 3 full seconds before she answered, the same 3 seconds, though he would never know it, that she had once spent staring at the torn halves of a betrothal scroll on a marble floor while 700 nobles laughed. Discretion, she repeated softly, is an interesting word to use with me, Your Highness. I find I have grown rather tired of it these past 2 years." And with that, she reached up slowly and drew back her veil. The color drained from Prince Alaric's face so completely that for a moment Seraphina thought he might actually collapse where he stood. Isolde Marchetti's hand flew to her mouth, a small, involuntary sound of shock escaping her, the first genuine, unguarded expression Seraphina had ever seen on that carefully composed face. "Seraphina," the prince breathed, as though saying her name might make the sight in front of him less real. This is not possible. You disappeared. You fled in disgrace." "I fled," Seraphina agreed calmly, "because you left me nothing else to do, your highness. You tore a scroll at my feet in front of 700 witnesses, and called me a thief in the same breath you promised your future to a woman whose family fortune, as it turns out, does not exist." She let that land, watching Isolde's composure crack further. "I disappeared, yes. I did not, however, disappear into disgrace. I disappeared into your treasury, your highness, quietly, patiently, for 2 years, and I find now that I have finished counting that your entire kingdom owes me a rather significant debt." Tobias stepped forward at her small nod and opened the heavy ledger he had carried in, laying it open on the table between them with the same precise, unhurried movements he had once used to change the entire course of her life, 11 years after her grandmother's disappearance. Page after page in careful, undeniable detail laid out everything. The Duvalle Concord's controlling stake in the Imperial Bank, charter the Crown's outstanding war bonds now majority held by that same Concord, and most devastatingly, the true source of the wedding's generous Marchetti funding. Traced through 3 layers of borrowed loans back to the Crown's own strained treasury. "Your wedding, your highness," Seraphina said, "is being paid for with money the Empire does not have borrowed against a fortune house Marchetti does not possess. Arranged by a man who has spent the last decade skimming commissions from the Crown's own war funding, while dressing his theft in patriotic language." She turned finally to look directly at Lord Bertrand Marchetti, who had entered moments earlier at the sound of raised voices and now stood frozen in the doorway. A man who, when his crimes finally began to surface, chose to send an assassin after me rather than face the consequences of his own greed. At Tobias's signal, 2 of Cashin's men brought forward the young man from the cellar beneath Ashkeep, cleaned up, sober and terrified, but resolute, who repeated in a shaking voice the same confession he had given weeks earlier. Hired by Lord Bertrand Marchetti himself, paid in coin, bearing the Marchetti crest, sent to kill the woman whose financial investigations threatened to expose his patron's crimes. The chamber erupted. Isolde rounded on her father with an expression of horrified betrayal that told Seraphina, with grim satisfaction, that whatever else Isolde Marchetti was, she had genuinely not known the full extent of her family's rot. Prince Alaric, cornered between a fiancé whose fortune had just been revealed as fiction and a former betrothed whose fortune could apparently unmake his entire kingdom's finances, seemed, for the first time in his gilded life, to have no rehearsed speech ready at all. "What do you want?" he finally managed, his voice stripped of all its earlier court polish. "Name it. Gold, land, a formal apology before the court, anything within my power, Lady Duvalle, and it is yours." Seraphina considered him for a long moment, this man who had once seemed to hold her entire world in his careless hands, who now stood small and desperate in front of her, propped up by borrowed gold and a fiancé's collapsing fortune. She found, to her own quiet surprise, that she felt no urge to destroy him utterly. 2 years of patient, disciplined work had already done something far more thorough than cruelty ever could have. It had simply made his contempt irrelevant. "I do not want your gold, your highness," she said. "I hold more of it than your treasury does. I do not want your apology, because it would mean nothing coming from a man who has clearly never once reflected on what he did. What I want," she continued, her voice carrying with the same calm clarity that had once silenced 700 laughing nobles, "is for the truth to finally be spoken in the same hall where the lie was told. I want the emperor to know exactly how his war has been funded, and by whom, and at whose expense. I want Lord Marchetti's crimes, the fabricated dowry theft, the manufactured tax debt against my family, the burned warehouse, the hired assassin, presented to the imperial court with the same ceremony my humiliation once received. And then, your highness, I want to be allowed to walk away and never think of this court again." It took 12 days for the emperor's own investigators, presented with Tobias's meticulous ledgers and the assassin's sworn confession, to confirm every claim beyond dispute. Lord Bertrand Marchetti was stripped of his titles and estate, his remaining assets seized to partially repay the Crown's own drained treasury, and exiled to the Empire's furthest northern province under permanent watch. Isolde, her family's fortune and reputation both in ruins, quietly withdrew from court entirely, Her engagement to the prince dissolved in a scandal that made Seraphina's own 2 years earlier look, by comparison, almost gentle. Prince Alaric, humiliated before the very court that had once laughed at his side, found his position as heir formally reviewed by the Emperor's council. His judgment, competence, and character all called publicly into question in a way no future ruler of Salmir could easily recover from. And in the grand hall of Salmir Palace, in the same spot where a torn betrothal scroll had once fallen at her feet, the Emperor himself, an old, tired man who had watched his kingdom's finances crumble under corruption he had been too distant to see, stood before the assembled court, the same court that had once howled with laughter, and asked Lady Seraphina Duvalle publicly, humbly, what the empire could possibly offer a woman who had already proven she needed nothing from it at all. The grand hall was silent again, the same particular silent Seraphina remembered from 2 years earlier, when she had stood in this exact spot in a gown the color of drowned pearls and refused to cry. This time the silence was not cruel, it was waiting. She looked around the hall slowly at the nobles who had once laughed, and now would not meet her eyes at her father standing proud and upright near the front with Rilla, beside him at Cashin near the doorway watching her with quiet steady patience. At Tobias holding the same worn ledger that had carried her grandmother's legacy across 11 silent years, and finally improbably into daylight. And she understood, standing there, that the answer she was about to give the Emperor had been forming inside her since the night she picked up 2 torn halves of a scroll and refused to beg. Your Majesty, she said, and her voice carried clean and unshaking to every balcony, I do not want a title. I do not want land seized from a disgraced family, or a formal place at your court, or a marriage arranged to repair what your son broke. I watched what happens to women who build their worth around a crown's approval, Your Majesty. My own grandmother had to disappear for 11 years to escape it. I have no intention of disappearing again, but I have even less intention of staying to be owned by it. A murmur rippled through the hall, uncertain, and the Emperor leaned forward on his throne, genuinely curious now rather than merely dutiful. Then what would you have of me, Lady Duvalle? Restore my father's estate and title in full, with a formal, public acknowledgement that House Duvalle was innocent of every accusation laid against it, she said. Beyond that, Your Majesty, I ask for nothing from this court, because everything else I need I have already built myself 300 miles from this hall without anyone's permission. The Emperor granted it within the hour. Visibly relieved to escape the encounter with his own dignity and treasury both still intact, and the court of Salmir watched stunned into a silence far more profound than the laughter that had once filled that same hall as Lady Seraphina Duvalle, head of the Ren Duvalle trading conquered. Majority holder of the crown's own war debt, the wealthiest individual in an empire that had once cast her out as worthless, turned and walked out of the grand hall without a single backward glance at the throne that had never truly held power over her at all. What came after in the months and years that followed was not the stuff of grand court ceremony, and Seraphina found she preferred it that way. House Duvalle was restored, her father spending his remaining years finally at peace, proud beyond words of the daughter who had rebuilt everything from ashes he never knew she was standing in. The Ren Duvalle conquered grew steadily into the most powerful trading institution on the continent, its influence over salt, silk, banking, and shipping routes stretching across 6 kingdoms, answering to no single crown, beholden to no noble house's approval, precisely as her grandmother had always intended it to be. Cashin remained at her side not as a prize won through revenge or a political alliance arranged for advantage, but as something Seraphina had never quite let herself hope for during those 2 hard, disciplined years of building, a partner who had watched her become exactly who she was always meant to be and loved her not despite the coldness that survival had once demanded of her but for the warmth she had never fully lost beneath it. Their eventual marriage, held quietly at Ashkeep Cove rather than any grand cathedral, was attended by exactly the people who had actually earned a place in her life. Her father, Rilla Tobias, a handful of Vessing Guild masters who had believed in Ren before anyone at Salmir ever knew her true name. Prince Alaric, stripped of his position as heir within a year of the scandal, lived out his life as a minor, largely forgotten member of the royal family. His name remembered at court mostly as a cautionary tale told to young nobles about the cost of cruelty dressed up as pride. Isolde Marchetti disappeared from public life entirely. Seraphina, when she thought of either of them at all in the years that followed, found she felt something closer to distant pity than the burning fury that had once driven her across an ocean to rebuild her entire life from nothing. Years later, when young noblewomen from disgraced or struggling houses across the continent began quietly seeking out the Ren Duvalle conquered, drawn by whispered stories of a woman who had turned public humiliation into an empire. Seraphina made it a personal practice to meet with each of them herself. In the same modest study at Ashkeep Cove, where Tobias had once told her the truth about her grandmother by firelight, she never promised them revenge. She promised them instead exactly what her grandmother's letter had once promised her, that the world's cruelty was never proof of their worthlessness, only proof of how afraid certain people were of what they might become if given the chance to rise. And on quiet evenings, when the trade ledgers were finally closed and the harbor lanterns of Ashkeep Cove burned gold against the darkening water, Seraphina would sometimes take out the two torn halves of an old betrothal scroll, kept all these years in a small wooden box beside her grandmother's wren-shaped signet ring, and remember the girl who had once knelt to pick them up in front of 700 laughing nobles, believing in that moment that she had lost everything. She had not lost everything that night. She had simply finally been shown exactly what she never needed.